Hello everyone, it's Fine and Steady, and boy, do I have a topic for you guys today. One of the biggest criticisms of Bitcoin right now is its energy consumption, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. First of all, I need to tell you how miners choose where they mine, so we need to go into how exactly mining works, a very brief summary of that, and what are the actual business costs that miners have. And second of all, we're actually going to look into the numbers of how much Bitcoin is consuming to figure out, hey, is the energy consumption of Bitcoin actually a problem, or is it a kind of a non-issue at the end of the day? So let's get right into it. First off, let's start with how mining works. Very simply, all you have to know is that simultaneously there are a bunch of computers all around the world spread out by individual operators, by big operators, small operators, all kinds of computers spread out all over the world, and they're all individually contributing to managing the Bitcoin network. And simultaneously, all of them try to solve a really complicated math problem, and at random, one of them is going to actually find the correct solution, and that's the moment that they actually get Bitcoin rewards, because when they find that solution, they are the ones who are allowed to add a list of transactions onto the mega list of transactions. That's what mining is. Now we know what mining is. Now we talk about what are the costs that miners actually have. Well, it's very simple. There's only two. One cost is the price of electricity, and the second cost is the price of computers. Now, for Bitcoin mining operations, actually very specific, specialized computers are being used. So the price of those, well, there's only a couple of locations in the world that actually make these types of computers. So no matter where you're buying it from, that price is more or less constant. Doesn't matter if you live in Antarctica, doesn't matter if you live in South Africa, China, North America. The cost of the computers is pretty much equal everywhere. So that's kind of not a differentiating factor between miners. One, computing power, not a factor. Two, the electricity. Because to run a computer, what do you need? You need electricity. And this is the differentiating factor between the miners. Because if they have access to cheaper electricity, it means their mining costs and their business costs are lower, and they are left with more Bitcoin at the end of the month. So, main differentiating factor that Bitcoin mining operations have control over is their cost of electricity. So that's point number two, electricity, and that's the one we're going to focus on because computing costs are the same across the board. So you might think then, all right, well, the cheapest electricity is probably coming from coal, from fossil fuels, so that's why they're probably setting up in those types of countries, which cause a lot of waste, and the arguments are valid and Bitcoin sucks. Well, surprisingly enough, it's not true. The cheapest places on Earth where there's excess electricity is actually in places where there's renewable electricity. Guess why? Well, when you have a renewable energy source running, that thing is creating energy no matter if it's being consumed or not. So if that device, a hydroelectric dam or a wind turbine or a solar panel, is generating extra electricity that's not being used, in most cases, it's actually just lost. Many places don't have any kind of storage facilities for this extra type of energy. So if you have a lot of energy being created and not a lot being consumed, well, the energy there is going to be very cheap. And that's why actually the cheapest energy in the world right now comes from renewable sources. Cool, right? So what's so great about Bitcoin is that every single time people think, finally, there's a crack in the Bitcoin armor, the actual simplicity of Bitcoin and the actual market forces driven behind it that were thought of on the conception by Satoshi Nakamoto every single time cause Bitcoin to self-correct itself, which is absolutely amazing. So even if Bitcoin has very high energy consumptions, the motivation for the miners is such that they go and seek out excess renewable energy, which would simply have been lost anyway. So even if they're consuming a lot of electricity, because they're consuming this very specific green electricity, in my opinion, it's actually not a factor at all when you should be thinking about whether or not Bitcoin is safe for the environment or not. This energy is there, it's not being used. So if the Bitcoin miners say, hey, hi, can we use it? Is that cool with you guys? They're going to be like, yeah, of course. this would have been wasted. Now we're going to make some kind of very low profits on it. Thanks, guys. Thanks for setting up your operations here. And that's exactly what happens. So let's get into the numbers. You are going to see conflicting reports all over the internet because the numbers have changed a lot year over year over year, and even in between the different months. And there's two main indices which are being used. One is run by Cambridge, who have self-admitted that most likely their data is invalid at this point and will only be updated sometime in 2021. And the other index is run by Digiconomist. And these guys as well come up with a figure, but this data is also usually outdated. As you can see, even between the two main indices which are being used, we have a discrepancy here of 78 terawatt hours versus 111 terawatt hours for the Cambridge data. So if these are the two biggest indices which are being used, and the landscape of Bitcoin energy consumption is changing so often, we need to find the most recent trustworthy report. And guess what? Well, the most recent report comes from the University of Cambridge, who also maintain one of the most used indices, but their report has data which is not reflected yet on the index, and they show that 76% of digital currency miners use renewable power sources. That in itself is not enough, because if a miner is using renewable power sources sometimes, that would make them eligible for this list. So let's say you use renewable energy 10% of the time, well, technically you're part of that 76%. But if the other 90% you're burning paper for your energy power, well, that's still very polluting, and then this number would not really be an accurate reflection. And that's an argument which is being used very, very, very often against these figures. Well, I've looked deeper than that. So, from the data from the University of Cambridge, Deutsche Bank came up with their own report, as well as the Chinese National Energy Agency, Morgan Stanley, and CoinShares. And guess what? The reports from these four organizations highlights that 78% of Bitcoin's total electricity usage is from renewables. 78% of Bitcoin's electricity usage is from renewables. I said it a second time because here they're talking about all of Bitcoin's energy consumption. They're not saying that some miners are actually using renewables. No, 78% of all Bitcoin mined is mined from this green energy, which I explained to you before. Let's dig deeper into the numbers. And here we see the biggest regions which are responsible for Bitcoin mining operations. And we see as well how much of the global mining each region does. So Sichuan is a city in China, and they're responsible for 48% of all of Bitcoin mining in the world. Then you have the rest of China, which accounts for approximately 12%. And then we have relevant Western regions, which are mostly along the border of US and Canada, as well as places like Iceland, where you have a lot of geothermal energy, and some countries that have some of the lowest energy costs in the entire world. All right. So as you see here, if you add all of these guys up, you come to 100% of global mining. Now, the second number we have here is 90.1%, which is the renewables penetration. What does that mean? It means that in the city of Sichuan, 90% of all the energy consumed in the city comes from renewables, right? So if we go on, I'll give you another example. 47% renewables penetration in the rest of China. That means that in the rest of China, where Bitcoin mining operations are, approximately 47% of the energy there comes from renewables, and the other percentage does not. And in the rest of the world, well, we're at 18% that comes from renewables. Now we understand this number, we understand this number. Let's go to these two numbers. Let's move on to the share of renewables used for mining. Well, if you take this number and multiply it by this number, you reach this number. So what we have in this column is how much of the global mining share Sichuan has, which is coming from renewables, and how much of their share comes from fossil or nuclear mining. As well, if we go to the second place, which is the relevant remaining China, we see that of the total mining done in the world, they account for 5.7% plus 6.3%, which gives you 12%, right? So combined, they make up 12% of the global mining share. And of this 12%, 5.7 of that comes from renewables, and 6.3% of that comes from fossil and nuclear. Let's do it one more time just to make sure you guys are understanding what's happening here. So the relevant Western regions global mining share is 35%. 27.8 of this 35 comes from renewable energy, and the remaining 7.2 of this 35 comes from fossil fuels and a little bit from nuclear. So if we add all of this up, what do you need to take away from this? Well, it's in the title, and it's what I said before. 78% of Bitcoin's entire electricity usage comes from renewables. P.S. Note from the editor, me, because I forgot to mention it in the video. Well, if you're curious what the total amount of Bitcoin's energy consumption is, currently approximately what Chile or Austria are using as a country as a whole, which is quite a lot overall, but watch the rest of the video. Just to make sure 100% that you guys understood, the global total of mining is 100% of the mining share, right? So in the world, you have 100% of all Bitcoin mining operations because there's no mining operations on Mars yet. Of this 100% of all mining, 78, right, 77.6 rounded up, comes from renewables, and 22.4 comes from fossil fuels and nuclear. So let me ask you then this question. Any operations which have 78% of their energy usage coming from renewables, would you guys say that that is a high target, a low target? I don't know. What's your opinion? My opinion? 78% is brilliant. Look, this energy is just sitting there. It would be unconsumed anyway. If Bitcoin was taking energy away from the power grid, right? If because of Bitcoin mining, you couldn't run, I don't know, the street lights anymore in the city, that's a different conversation. That's not the conversation that we're having here. The conversation that's being had here is that most of Bitcoin's energy comes from places where they have renewable energy power plants, which are creating energy no matter what, 24/7, and usually lack any kind of storage capacities for this energy. So if they generate more energy than what the local population is using, well, the rest of it is just lost. And that's how the Bitcoin miners are going there, because the excess energy there is so cheap, right? If this energy is just going to be lost, you're going to be willing to give it away for a very low price. So once again, Bitcoin self-corrects and fixes any fundamental issues with it because of the incentive structure that was thought of in the very beginning. I personally think that's absolutely amazing. I did not think 78% of all of Bitcoin's energy usage was coming directly from renewables. That's a surprise to me. If you got smarter, I'm a little bit out of breath, and I have dumplings coming in a moment, so that's going to be great. If you guys learned something and you thought that this video was informative and useful for you, please like and subscribe, and see ya. Bye, guys.